we go forward. I'm going to forgo asking questions and turn to my colleagues with the proviso that Mr. Laird is expected, as I think Ms. Ross is, at the Senate's hearing, and so we want to try and keep things moving. We'll start with Mr. Williams and then Mr. Gordon, Mr. Obernolte.
So great comments. I think you covered all the things that I wanted to know about, at least that we haven't in our personal meetings. I would ask you to put a little short elaboration on the scale difference when you mention something like overproduction, because otherwise I think it really feeds into a mythology that everything's already taken care of, and without comparing that level of overproduction in the spring to the scale of underproduction in the summer peak period, where we still do not have enough renewables online, and where we're still firing up old, dirty, polluting power plants that a lot of people thought were going to be shut down a long time ago. So could you explain the scale difference there? Because I think that's really important to add. Otherwise, people are going to walk away with the wrong impression.
Probably 12 to 15 days per year that where the ramp between the late morning, early afternoon, and the peak of cooling need in California is about 13 gigawatts. And it just is fast. And so we need resources that can come online within about a half hour. You got to go from 0 to 60. And so currently, there are two technologies that are widespread and reasonably affordable that do that. One is natural gas peakers. The other is hydro. Battery storage actually has some opportunities, and it's easier to fit into local areas and has less impact in the surrounding communities. So wind can help, but our wind resource really tends to be later in the afternoon. So how do we fill that in? What's the most economic way to optimize the resources we currently have and to do that in the future? So that's part of our challenge. The additional challenge, again, is that if you have a lot of those resources, then you're likely, depending on the resource, particularly solar PV, then early spring, late fall, parts of the winter, you're going to have excess. And so how do you design a system then that is more flexible to reflect the nature of these technologies, one, and California's overall energy demand? I don't think we're seeing a lot of growth in demand. I don't expect to see a lot of growth in the near future until we start to see demand come from transportation, fuel switching there, and fuel switching probably in the built environment. If you look at the California carbon budget, about 20% of the carbon comes from the electric system. Probably about 28% comes from the built environment, largely from use of gas for heating and cooling, and then 40% from transportation. So I think that some of our demand is going to come as we back out those very old baseload natural gas plants that we built and start to use more renewables, but also from growth in electrification of transportation and transit, and from changes in how we heat and cool in the built environment. And I think that those are all just a lot of different pieces we need to figure out how you weave together. I don't mean to undercut the absolute success of the RPS. It was a phenomenally successful program. But now that we actually have had that kind of a success, what are the other things that we need to pay our attention to? How do we weave it together into the most cost-effective, most reliable, and least greenhouse-intensive system?
Mr. Gordon.
Yes, quickly, two issues. One, first, This is not something I want you to respond to. I just wanted to give you notice that later today we'll be hearing from the LAO, and they've issued a report saying that what you have done with zero-based budgeting isn't that. I'm going to ask them that question and then want to explore that with you further at a later date.
Okay.
Future hearings. Secondly, I appreciated the comments that you've made to me about working to change the culture, and comments today about looking at perhaps a code for commissioners. You just recently filed a behested payment report showing that you raised over $50,000 for an event for your predecessor. Is that an issue, the issue of behested payments, something you'll be looking at in that code?
I wish I could say that I could raise $50,000. I actually, because I intend to be as transparent and as ethical as I can be, and because my name was mentioned on a flyer as a sponsor, I simply made the determination that I could not know who was contributing or why, and rather than guess whether somebody made a contribution based on the fact that I was going there, I just disclosed it. So I wish I could raise $50,000.
Mr. Obernolte.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Picker, I'm interested in also the code of conduct that you're proposing for the commissioners, and I think given the events of the last year that we would all agree that it's an excellent idea. I'm curious as to what the plan is for drafting that code, who is going to determine what's in the code, who's going to ratify the code, and what the timetable is for creating it.
Well, our first challenge was actually setting up committees where the commissioners would meet and talk to each other. So we've been talking about it fairly continuously since I became president. We talk about it on the agenda. We will probably finalize the design of those committees. One will probably focus on administration and finance, because our goal is to actually build on this I think, transparency budget that we've created to a realistic budget for the future. That will, the strategic planning process, because it will develop a strategic staffing process plan, will go to that committee. The other is a governance committee, and that governance committee is likely to be the place where we invest all of these different efforts. And so the commissioners will finalize it. They will have told me what their preferences are. I'll kind of sort through the workload and their interests. We'll make assignments to those subcommittees. They will meet the Wednesday before our next commission meeting after tomorrow's. They will file a work plan. And then they'll start to grind through that. I've told everybody that the governance committee needs to start with governance for the commissioners, and top priority is a code of conduct for the commissioners and a job description for the commissioners. Because again, if we're going to actually start to develop accountability measures and metrics for the rest of the organizations, we have to start with ourselves. And so my guess is that we probably sometime in March or early April should actually have some public meetings and some conversation on those codes of conduct. I will say that I've just skimmed the surface of things that we're doing. So one of the things that you'll see if you want copies of our fact sheets is we've hired an outside expert to look at best practices in ex parte communications. That actually started before I became president, but that will help to inform. I think that we'll get comments from staff, we'll get comments from outside stakeholders, and that's the point of meeting in public, is to actually be able to ask for that kind of comment, be accountable to it, and fairly transparent in how we adopt it and address it.
Thank you, Mr. Picker. So, boiling down what I heard you say, the commissioners are going to write their own code of conduct?
We're going to take that from probably some comments from our RLJs. We're going to build on the work that we're getting from this outside legal. He's a noted legal scholar who's surveying best practices. We'll put together a draft. We'll have people come and comment on it. But I think that from our perspective, the importance of us doing that is that I want to make sure that it's not some other level of compliance, but it's actually something that we actually own and that people can see and hold us accountable to.
All right. I think we would agree. I think it's the role of the code of conduct would be to restore the public's confidence in the commissioners. They're public servants as we are, and that public trust, I think, is vital to their ability to do their job. So we're going to be watching that process with a lot of interest.
Well, thank you, but in all candor, I think that no one thing is going to restore confidence or create a sense that we're actually being more effective. I think it's going to be a year to 2 years of hard work, and people will have to see, hear, taste, and feel the difference, and to see the results before they start to accept it. So, well, I agree with you. It's an important place to start. That's how I look at it. It's just the beginning.
Well, then we're in furious agreement.
Okay, thanks.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're welcome, and thank you again, Mr. Picker. I appreciate your spending time with us here this morning.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity.
Secretary Laird.
Good morning.
Welcome.
I heard the chair's desire to talk a little bit about climate, so I'm going to try to compress what I was going to say about the budget a little and highlight that in response to your request. And I know that I know from just arduous experience with the Budget Committee, you'll have a number of hearings where you go through every line item, so I am trying to just talk about the top lines in the budget. And I wanted to talk about water first. The chair did make some comments at the beginning, and our entire policy and actions of the last year have been around the Water Action Plan that Secretary of Ag, Secretary of EPA, and I issued a year ago last month. It was the framework for drought response. It was the framework that included the Groundwater Management Act. It was the framework around which the bond was constructed. And I've been asked to come to your hearing next week, which is on the which will highlight the Water Action Plan. So I will go into detail then, but we did just issue an update to the plan that is not really a change in the plan, but a report on the implementation. And I think that's what we will talk about at the hearing next week. The budget itself has $532.5 million from Proposition 1 proposed to go out the door. And those are the first expenditures. I should also note, if you try to weigh that against the $7.5 billion of spending in the bond, that $2.7 billion that is for storage is continuously appropriated. So the legislature does not have to act to get that money out the door. The schedule for dealing with the storage part of the bond was included in the bond, and we were on schedule with the Water Commission doing the process for considering proposals for storage. And we just look forward to different stakeholders working hard around the possibilities for storage and trying to use the time that the processes get together to put together the nuts and bolts of a storage project. It's not as if the storage projects are all there ready to go right now. It really involves commitments of money, might even be land, might even be some jurisdictions and joint powers agreements. That is what we need to be using this time for among the stakeholders that are interested in storage proposals, so that when we are ready with the process to consider it in front of the Water Commission for the bond money, there are actually proposals that are ready. Additionally, in the budget is $1.2 billion of flood money, almost all from a bond that was adopted in 2006. This was the subject of a hearing that we participated in about 2 weeks ago. And there was a question about the money heading out the door and what is the urgency. And frankly, the bond, Prop 1E, that was passed by the voters in 2006, set a deadline that the money had to be appropriated by 1 year from now, or else it was gone. There were questions about, well, why hasn't the money been appropriated to date? It's 8 years since the bond passed. I can't speak to the 4 years of the prior administration, but when this administration took office, we were in the middle of a fundamental economic downturn in which bond monies were not being sold unless they were sold at the end of the previous administration. And so once that started to move as the economy came back, we have projects that are moving, and the question is do some of them have to stop awaiting further action on the bond money? And there are locals at many places that are looking for the state commitment to be able to match what they are bringing to the table to move the projects, and that is the sense of urgency. And the Central Valley Flood Plan was approved in the early part of this administration, and it does provide the framework for this bond money, and it actually targets a need that is much greater than the amount of bond money that is available and we are asking to appropriate. So that's why it's important to leverage other funds, local funds, and as much as we can with getting this money out the door. Additionally, there was a major hearing yesterday that I led off between the Senate and the Assembly on the subject of parks. The Parks Forward Commission, which was funded by private philanthropy, which the administration appointed the members of, made its report earlier this month, and basically we embraced that report. What this budget does is it includes $16.8 million above the current level to just keep parks where it is now until we can see where this report goes in a year, and it includes $20 million of deferred maintenance, toward deferred maintenance in state parks. And the one thing we are doing is we have created a parks transformation team internally. 15 people, headed by Steve Zaley, who used to be the head of the Counties Association and was the person that came in for a couple of years at economic bad times as the acting CAO in Sacramento County and worked hard to turn that around. And we're referring everything that is a long-term recommendation of the Parks Forward Commission to that team, so that we know that while we're still having the parks director and the infrastructure running the 280 park system, we have a dedicated team to deal with the long-term changes. And many people think that this report was about money. And yes, there are recommendations about a stable funding stream going forward, but we don't think it's appropriate to address those issues until we address the fundamental structural issues that are a problem in the department. So we are hoping over the next year to address a significant number of those and see where we are. And we could not wait for the report, so we started a number of things beforehand. Basically, at almost every park, you could not get in through electronic payment. And we are now up to 120 parks where you can do that. Until a year ago, you could not get the cost of an individual park, what the revenue is or expenditures by park. We had the first report of that a year ago. We updated it. That's very important for partners to know how much they might be able to contribute or what the needs are of an individual park. There were a couple of media accounts that said, oh, geez, a substantial number of the parks don't make money. They are actually public trust as historical and cultural and recreational resources. They were not designed to be 100% self-sufficient. And so the question is how we guarantee the state part while trying to leverage private funds out of parks. That budget appropriation allows us the year to address those issues. With CAL FIRE, we have an increase in the budget that really affects the fact that we have a longer fire season this year, and we have to have a surge capacity because CAL FIRE has the ethic that you commit large resources right at the beginning of the fire to try to knock it down in the first day in a way that you don't have these fires that get away. This last year there were two incidences. There was the fire in Placer County that actually advanced 50,000 acres in one overnight, where you just cannot do that. And the San Diego fires of last May, the winds were whipping at 50 and 60 miles an hour, and they were away as they were lit. So basically, with the rest of them, we try to do that. It's one way of limiting costs, but it's one way of limiting damage, emissions, and all the other things that come from fires. With cap and trade, we have a piece of the cap and trade program that is dedicated to resources issues. We have an ag land protection portion that is part of the Strategic Growth Councils. We have wetlands that are part of the Department of Fish and Wildlife and money for that. We have sustainable forests that are with CAL FIRE, and we also have energy efficiency in public buildings, which is lodged with the Energy Commission, which is within the Resources Agency. Every one of those programs is moving with regulations, in some cases with applications, and we hope to have those moving. Now, on the saying that so that I can get to the climate issues, structurally, by executive order in the previous administration that continues to this one, the Environmental Protection Agency deals with programs having to do with greenhouse gas emissions, and the Resources Agency is charged with adaptation to changes in the climate. In 2009, there was a adaptation strategy issued by the administration. This last July, we issued the Safeguarding California report, which is an update of that and how we provide guidance and try to influence government agencies on the issues of adaptation in California. And so we have an implementation team, and there will be an implementation report that is available in public and posted so that people can see what the steps are that are being taken in doing that. And then just if you look at maybe one issue, and I know it's one that's very close to Assemblymember Gordon's heart, because, excuse me, oceans is within the agency, but we have sea level rise as an adaptation issue. And through the Ocean Protection Council, we have done 14 grants for local coastal plan updates. One of them is to Santa Monica, and so that provides a framework for dealing with sea level rise issues in certain coastal areas. We have a funding wizard program so that locals can figure out where there are funds available to deal with sea level rise. We are implementing Assemblymember Gordon's bill. Thank you very much. With regard to a database on sea level rise, we have a survey piece of that is required back on July 1st. We hope to have it out there on what it means by January 1st. We expect to meet the dates that we have laid out in relation to what the bill laid out. And so we are moving ahead with that. And we are trying to, through working groups, guidances, work with local governments and other people around the state and stakeholders to implement some of the things that were set forth in the safeguarding report. It's a big challenge, but I think the part of the reason is that people can get their hands around greenhouse gas emission, and yet the public is not totally there yet in understanding what might need to be done in terms of adaptation. And if you're a coastal government, and I see at least 3 of you that have coast in your district, if you have local governments or local agencies that are doing water systems or wastewater systems that are set to the existing sea level, and yet they're building them for a life that might be 50 or 60 or 100 years, those are real issues. Development next to the coast, that's a real issue. There are whole hosts of things that are there that people need to be thinking about in terms of the actions they take governmentally, and we are really working with them to do that. And maybe just in closing, we also do the science related to some of the adaptation issues. We have the 4th assessment, climate change assessment going forward. The Ocean Protection Council, through the Ocean Science Trust, did elaborate science on what the potential is for sea level rise. There were ranges In 2050, the range was a 14-inch sea level rise in California, but it was a range. If worldwide we are not very successful in curbing emissions, it could be above that. If there is major success in curbing emissions, it could be lower than that. And when you look at 2100, it's in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 feet. And the thing about that is, that is an issue in extreme events. It is not, as I always say, not like a bathtub just filling up slowly and noticing the change. It is the 2-year-old cannonballing into the bathtub. And the day that we adopted and had that science in front of us at a meeting that I gavelled to order here in Sacramento at 9 o'clock, 8 a.m. that morning, the tsunami from Japan hit the California coast. And in my home area, in my former legislative district of Santa Cruz, there was significant damage in the port, as there was in Crescent City. That was at low tide before sea level rise. But that was the extreme event that we are talking about. So we are working hard on these issues, happy to go into greater detail with the committee whenever that's an issue. And ironically, the hearing that Secretary Ross and I are going to, that we sent Secretary Rodriguez over to stall for us about, is on adaptation. So that is what they are focusing on. So I'd be happy to answer any questions that the committee members might have.
And we will entertain questions now. And just to reassure you, time-wise, it's my understanding, at least as of the time you were beginning, Mr. Rodriguez hadn't even started over there. So I think we're doing reasonably well on
We've
time.
been texting the word stretch to him. So,
Mr. Gordon, did you have a...
Yeah, just appreciate the comment about adaptation. As I said earlier, I think that's really what we have to start thinking about for the future, and as it relates particularly to the issue of sea level rise. So appreciate those comments. Contingency plans for the drought, what are we looking at if we don't get any more rain?
well, I couldn't help. I heard Mr. Patterson refer to a wet blanket, and I wanted to jump out of my seat and say, unless it's an extreme emergency that's water intensive, please don't go to wet blankets. And the thing that, the water board had their hearing that was really packed last week. And one of the things is we were moving the planning earlier in the process. Normally, we would not be having some of these discussions till we were certain that the last rains had happened. And I think in order to be prepared, we are dealing with the operations plans for the system. We're dealing with having a full regimen in place earlier than ever before, even though we are all hopeful that we have late season storms like we did to some extent last year. And so there is money in the budget as if the drought is not lifted for drought planning and drought operations. And we have the operations in place with the state and federal governments on the water systems. And we are really looking to see, trying to be ready, trying to have that in place, what the last storms bring in finalizing some of the things. But it is our hope in December was the fact that there wasn't a recorded rainfall in most of this state in January was just really disconcerting.
I think Mr. Olbernotti and then Mr. Williams.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I had a question about the Department of Parks budget, and I was pleased to hear you say that the auditor's report, you were implementing some of those recommendations. I think there were 16 specific recommendations in that report, and I'm wondering how many of those you agree with, how many you're planning on implementing, and what the time frame is.
And you said the auditor. So is that the audit? We had 7 reports or investigations, and now the Parks Commission report. So I'm trying to just ascertain for sure which one of those you're referring to.
I'm referring to the auditor report.
Okay. It was our intent to work to implement every single thing in there, but I don't have it in front of me, so I can't tell you at what stage we are in dealing with implementation for each individual thing.
So
I'd be happy offline to deal with the specifics of each of those recommendations.
great, I'd appreciate that. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Williams?
I know you have always had a good reputation as creative policymaker, and so I wanted to urge you to not be sort of content with some of the silos that are inherent in in state government in general, not just the executive branch, because your resources could have a tremendous effect not just on adaptation, but on sequestration. I mean, there's no one more well situated to have a positive effect. If we could create good, positive, carrot-based incentives for ag sequestration, you guys are very well situated to be the ones pushing and to implement that. I'd also say that there's probably no one in the state that could affect peak periods of energy better than the Department of Water Resources. And so I just urge you that to not be content with those silos. I know you're a person that can break silos, and I hope you will continue to do that.
Break silos sounds so destructive. But I think that your point is well taken, and we are really conscious of it. And Secretary Ross may well speak about soils policy and sequestration values and different things that are happening, but with ag land protection, which is within our agency, that is why I fought so hard, Secretary Ross and I, almost single-handedly, to make sure there was a cap-and-trade allocation related to that. And part of it is the incentive that you talked about. It's really looking to people that are hanging on in the Williamson Act and having them prioritize through state grants that are available what are most at risk so that we can target whatever our policies are to the ag land that is most at risk of development. And what you said, too, about water, there is work being done in various quarters about the water energy nexus because such a chunk of California's energy production goes to the collection, treatment, distribution, wastewater, the whole continuum of how we deal with water in the system. And so if we conserve, and the Water Action Plan says water conservation needs to be a way of life in California, we're also conserving energy in the same breath. And so we are trying to make those links and trying to do it in a way that we are not working at cross purposes. There are moments that the 160 years of state government that existed before this administration walked in the door set up things that we are working to change, but it's a long haul, and we're committed to doing what you were talking about.
I just add management practices. If we're protecting those lands, also management practices factors in as well. We have great research coming out indicating that use of compost on rangeland fixes carbon in deep soil. Of course, it also has the benefits of producing more grass for feed and also saving water. So those are good things too. But I just think that if we're providing carrots, we should also not be shy about saying, okay, these are the things that we want for those carrots.
Appreciate your comment.